how can a carbon negative data center get funding to scale? So just to be clear, most data centers are carbon positive, meaning that they have a carbon footprint. The ones that are doing really well with their environmental, with their ESG kind of goals and prioritizing their commitment to sustainability, they get to the point where they're carbon neutral. Carbon negative means they're actually taking way more out than they're putting in. Very similar to like a data center that would be doing their own power generation and has so much power left over that they're returning power to the grid. I'm sure someone that specializes in sustainability can give a much more eloquent definition, but carbon negative data centers, I would guess, are in the top 10 or 20% for best practices in elite production and positioning for commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainability. At any rate, so how do you get funding for that kind of data center to scale? Well, it's the same way that you get funding for any kind of data center to scale. Is part of this depends on the company's size. Part of it depends on the marketplace, whether there's regulatory factors or not. Part of it depends on specialization. I'm for sure not an expert on raising capital in and around digital infrastructure, but like at a high level, it's another buyer persona. So it's figuring out like, okay, who are the investors or who is taking out the notes to be able to give us the funding that we need? Understanding what their requirements are, understanding what they care about. And like at a high level, when it comes to whoever within your company spends most of their time adjacent to or courting, nurturing, building relationships with potential investors or bankers, whoever are going to be giving you the funding you need, this is just another persona. These are just more people in your CRM. It happens to be people in your CRM that have a completely different buyer persona, because you certainly don't want to be blasting your investors or potential investors with the same kind of messaging that you do to one of your 1 or 2 or 3 core personas or channel partners or something like that. They care about vastly different issues. And that's the point with all of this, is that regardless of whether you're the CFO, whether you're the CEO who is actively involved in fundraising on a regular basis, you're going to get to know obviously what your capital needs, but you're going to get to know the VC, you're going to get to know the private equity, you're going to get to know the different stakeholders that could potentially invest in your data center expansion and what they care about. And to the extent that you want to wait to stay on their radar screen in between when you're going out for raises, a lot of the same methodology that you would use for courting, nurturing enterprise clients is many of the same steps that you can take with potential investors and others that you want to do funding with, meaning that having a newsletter, publishing reports, benchmarks, sharing news events, big wins, logos, case studies, all that stuff can be super helpful. But it starts with really understanding the consensus on what the investors or the debt holders or whoever is going to be involved in funding, what they care about, getting the consensus on their goals and challenges, what their criteria is, and then building a playbook to be able to build those relationships with them long before you need them. That's the key, is you don't want to be scrambling at the last minute. If you talk to anyone that spends a significant amount of time doing raising, it's very, very much relationship centric. And you should have, if you think about a typical buyer's journey that someone that's funding your company would go through, your pitch deck is like decision stage, but you still need like awareness and consideration type of content that educates and builds trust with those investors. So by the time you get to a meeting where you're going through the pitch deck with them, they already know who your company is. They know who some of the key leadership members are on your team. They know some of the big wins that you've had in the last several weeks and in the last several months. And they know your brand and in the space. So it makes everything quite a bit easier. So when it comes to getting funding to scale, the reality is you probably have more in common with other technology companies, like SaaS companies, than you likely realize. So for carbon neutral, for carbon negative, there's going to be certain venture capitalists, private equity firms, and other similar kind of funding sources that are especially aligned with your mission and your goal to be carbon negative. So I would lean heavily into that as well. But for sure, it's the same kind of general approach that content and events for potential investors. It's just that likely it's a much smaller segment, but for sure, the same kind of methodology that you would use for like account-based marketing and having, in the same way, instead of having an ideal client profile, you have an ideal investor profile, right? And from your ideal investor profile, you can build out a list of a couple dozen potential companies that might want to invest in your funding to scale your carbon negative data center business. And from that list of potential companies that would want to invest, you narrow it down to specific people in those companies that you need to be building relationships with. And how you get in front of them, some of it could be meeting up with them, setting up meetings at events where you know they're going to be attending. Some of it could be inviting them onto a podcast that you're hosting. Some of it could be inviting them to a panel, either in person or virtually, that you're hosting. Some of it could be inviting them to a roundtable discussion, private dinner with 5, 10, 20 stakeholders within the industry. There's a lot of different ways to tackle this. But at the end of the day, you need to be building relationships with these funding sources long before you need them. So use a lot of the same best practices that you would use for any kind of effort that you're using to build awareness of your business, except for the most part, these strategies will be executed by investor relations, CFOs, your CEOs, and there'll be different kinds of stakeholders that you're speaking to at these different kinds of companies. So that's my general insight on what I would focus on if you're looking to get funding to scale. But yeah, for sure, you need to make sure that your team is built in such a way that it's going to be appealing to investors, to venture capital, to private equity sources, because it's very, very likely the moment that you are looking to get to the next level with funding and expansion, that the pedigree, the resume of your CFO becomes incredibly important. So all of these should be factors that you're thinking about for your carbon neutral data center to get funding at scale.